I'm excited to be joined by Ken. Ken, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you teach.
My name's Ken Harris. I teach business and professional communication. I've also taught public speaking, introduction to mass different things like that at UTSA. I enjoy all of them, but I think business and professional, that focus is really where I'm most interested.
What are some of the practical tips and skills that you cover in that class that could be applicable to people who own businesses, who are entrepreneurs, are communicating with other employees? I'm sure there's a lot of really practical stuff in that class that could help a lot of people.
Listening. One of the biggest challenges I think business owners and businesses in general face, people not listening well, which in turn results in orders being messed up, money being lost, customers being lost. So improving listening skills is really vital. Nonverbal communication, when they're dealing face-to-face with customers, with their employees, or with their employer, the ability to convey your thoughts in a way that's not only accurate verbally, but that your nonverbals match what you're saying so that there's less confusion in the interchange. That's really important. How to write emails effectively. Things of that type, I think, are really important for people who want to succeed in the business realm.
There's a lot there to unpack. Let's start with listening. What are some things that you suggest business owners, entrepreneurs, or students who are studying business communication do to improve the way they listen?
Well, one thing would be to engage in more active listening. I think many of us, our minds wander. We don't really focus. Our phones are always driving us crazy. That there's the ghost ping of the phone that we imagine the phone is doing something because we've become so addicted to them. So active listening, where you eliminate distractions, you look at the individual, or if it's on a phone call, you don't try to multitask. You can't really do that effectively. You turn away from your computer, you make sure that phone is off, the TV's off, there's no YouTube videos running, and you really look at the individual. If you're facing them face to face, you lean forward, you nod, you give affirmative nonverbal feedback. Don't interrupt needlessly. If you need to ask a question to clarify something, that's one thing, but to interrupt because we just want to get our own thoughts in, that impedes effective listening. And so there are things like that that you can do to really help yourself become much better at it. And I think then that improves morale in the workplace. It improves profitability in your company. Things of that type are really beneficial.
It connects to almost every other level of communication, right? Even though we don't have necessarily but one course on listening, if you're majoring in communication, you might get to take a course on listening. And we only have a little bit of time to cover it in a business communication class, for example. It really connects to these other skills.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you connect listening to some of these other skills that are covered in business communication that can lead employees to have better relationships, entrepreneurs to have better client relationships, or business owners to have a better bottom line?
When an owner or business owner has employees in today's world, the odds are really good that it'll be people from a variety of backgrounds. And sometimes there can be language challenges, accents, different proficiencies, perhaps in other languages than in the owner's own language. And so the ability to really sit down, concentrate, listen to that employee is going to help the employee stay, for one thing, so that they're not having to rehire and retrain people. It will improve that employee's morale, and many times I think it improves productivity as well, which increases profitability, which is the reason the business is there. That type of thing is really important. In listening and nonverbal communication, we know that nonverbal comprises up to 2/3 or more of the meaning of any message in a face-to-face or online setting. If they're able to do that and to pay attention to convey the proper nonverbals to the person that is speaking, it will enhance that communication event as well. So I think it really improves morale and improves productivity, employee retention. Things of that type can really help that business do better.
And whenever we're thinking about listening and how it connects to all these different areas of the business, I imagine the hiring of people is one of the things that comes to top of mind, especially for those who are working in the hiring department of their businesses. Can you give us some examples of what would be useful from a business communication perspective in the hiring process or from the perspective of the person being interviewed?
When you think in terms of the person conducting the interview, sometimes people in that setting will inadvertently convey things that make the interview unsuccessful. Perhaps they ask questions that violate the law. They don't mean to, but not knowing certain things, they'll do things that could result in a lawsuit. So that's definitely, you don't want that. Also, you want to make sure that the person doing the interviewing is asking the right questions so that they are able to really ascertain whether or not the person being interviewed is the best fit for the position. Closed-end questions, questions with a yes or no answer, can be part of the interview, but they need to expand beyond that and ask questions that really allow the individual to open up and share their knowledge, their experiences, their expertise, to see if things are really going to fit with that person and to see if that person's personality will fit with the company. They may be someone who has the technical expertise to do the job, but if the personality is going to create problems within the department, that type of thing needs to be uncovered as much as possible in that interview session. And now, for someone who's being interviewed, learning to answer questions as specifically as possible, to have concrete examples, to avoid denigrating previous employers, things like that are really valuable. So learning those types of things, which are basic things and yet very essential things, can make that whole process be more productive for the company and the person who's seeking it.
We're in a season right now of layoffs in the news. We just went through a big hiring sprint, and now we're in the season of layoffs. What advice would you give to the person who was just laid off, who needs to have all their ducks in a row to get ready for that interview? They need to research the company. They need to prepare maybe behavioral interview answers.
Yes.
Can you share a little bit about that?
You feel very bad for people who have been laid off. And as you note, there have been quite a few lately from companies that I don't think we would have expected that from at this point. But things are changing very quickly. So when a person's in that type of situation, they need to, first of all, look at their resume. They want to make sure that each time they apply for a position, that resume is tailored to that position. Don't include superfluous information that's not pertinent to that specific job. Obviously, they want to be honest on their resume. We keep hearing stories of people that pad their resume, that put in information that's inaccurate, and they end up being discovered at some point and either certainly don't get the job, or if they're hired, they're fired later. So, honest content is really important. In the resume, they want to list specific, measurable, concrete achievements at previous jobs. Anything that has to do with production numbers being increased, sales being increased, things that are measurable that they can list that they had a part in. Those are good things to put into the resume. Obviously, if they have references, they want to make sure the person that they are using as a reference has agreed to do so that they don't list somebody who is surprised when they get a call about this individual. Resumes need to be short. Many times in larger companies anyway, resumes are fed through computer, and the computer is looking for certain key words. And if those words are not in the resume, they won't even be asked for an interview. So they want to tailor the resume to this specific job posting. They need to realize that most of the time in a resume, someone will make a decision within 15 seconds as to whether or not they're even going to look further and possibly considering inviting the person in. So it needs to be written clearly, succinctly, in a way that grabs the attention. It must not be too long. I have seen resumes that were 3 pages long. That type of thing is pretty much, will guarantee that you won't be considered. And there may be a few fields where that would be appropriate. For most of us, 1 page, 2 at the most, is all you would ever want to do in a resume like that.
I love that idea of adaptation, because I think adaptation can apply to other parts of the interview process too. The next step, after they've seen the resume, they like what they see, and they've invited you for that interview, what to do to prepare for that conversation.
Some people don't prepare. They think they can go in and wing it with the interview, and most of us can't do that. I mean, interviews are nerve-wracking for most people, probably one of the most anxiety causing things you'll ever endure, especially if your situation is rather desperate and financially you really need the job. And so that just amps up the pressure. So one thing they should always do is research that company. Try to find out who is running the company, as much information about the key leadership of the company as possible. If you can, find out who will be conducting the interview and research that person. If you can know their background, there might be ways that you can connect with that person based on legitimate things in your life and their life. And that certainly can be helpful. You want to know what the company does, know what product they produce, what service they offer. If their financials are available, research those financials. Have their sales been growing? What areas have their sales been growing? Those types of things can help you and sound much more knowledgeable when you go into that interview, rather than just someone who goes in and has no idea what it is the company is doing. So that type of research is really important, and it's readily available today. You can find out so much in a very relatively short period of time. They need to think about, beyond the yes and no questions, anticipate specific types of behavioral questions. And they can find these types of questions on Indeed.com. There are many websites that offer these types of things as examples. But ideally, you would want to look at those, write out your answers, and practice delivery. Not that it would ever be a memorized thing or a word-for-word rendition of those answers, but know what you want to say. And when they ask questions, give me an example of when you confronted a critical fellow employee. How did you handle that? When you dealt with an angry customer, when you helped increase productivity in a department. Try to think about those things and have answers ready for them. And of course, always you want to be honest. Dishonesty will eventually catch up to you at some point. But think about these things, practice them ahead of time. Record yourself practicing these interviews. Get a friend to help you to ask the questions that you anticipate. Look at yourself. What nonverbals are you giving off as you answer those questions? That's really important because you want to sound confident. You want to look confident. The way you're sitting, the way you're using your hands, all of that's really important. If you're fidgeting with your hands, if you won't look at the person in the eye, that type of thing, it can really hurt you. So you need to do that type of thing. And the question they always ask at the end, do you have any questions for us? You need to prepare for that. You need to think about specific questions you can ask. Not having those questions could easily indicate to the person doing the interview that you're really not that interested. Questions like, how did you get to the position you're in this company? What training would I be provided so I could advance? Where can I grow? What do you see as the greatest need I can meet in your company? You want to think about these types of questions so that it shows that you're interested, that you've thought through things. I think those types of things are real important.
Are there any paradigms that students struggle to learn or apply?
I do think my experience is such that in working with students, talking to them, trying to be as helpful as possible, they may give themselves too much credit with being able to go in not having prepared.
So one of the problems that you see most often with people approaching the interview process is lack of preparation?
Yes, that is a real issue. If a person is someone that things have come easily to them, perhaps in school, and they didn't have to really study a great deal, which some folks are like that. I was never like that, but some folks are like that. They may approach the job interview that way, not realizing that they're competing with 30 other people who are just as smart as they are. If they don't go in there having done their very best to get ready, they can really hurt themselves.
From the perspective of the person hiring again, what are people looking for as they are in the frame of mind of someone who is looking to hire? I know I've talked to some entrepreneurs who really struggle with hiring the right people. Maybe they've been burned. Maybe they hired someone that didn't work out. What do you suggest they look for on that other side of the conversation?
And it's easy to do, obviously, because people who are being interviewed are going to put their best foot forward. They're going to look their best. They may cover up things about themselves that show up later if they're hired and cause problems. I think it's easy to determine someone's, looking at the resume, maybe by asking some basic questions, easy to determine their technical expertise or if they have the knowledge needed to do the job, the experience to do the job. Maybe they've done it prior. I think the much more challenging thing is the interpersonal, the personality issues, because we all know we've worked with people who could do the job, but they were not very pleasant people, and they made the workplace difficult because of the personality conflicts. It seems to me that is probably the biggest challenge. Some companies have potential employees do psychological tests to see what their personality is and if it will fit in that place. I think if a company can afford to do that, that is a good idea, because working where there's a lot of conflict, as we all know, is not much fun. And so anything we can do to prevent that, in hiring the wrong person, and then if they're let go, the chance of being sued for that type of thing, anything we can do to prevent that is really helpful.
You mentioned conflict. So immediately I'm like, ooh, I know he knows a lot about conflict management, mediation, and managing these kinds of very difficult or sensitive situations that happen in the workplace.
Well, we know conflict's inevitable, and it's not bad necessarily. People need to be able to express their differing opinions. The challenge, of course, is learning to do that in a way that doesn't destroy the relationship or harm the department as a whole or hurt the company or lose customers. When you think about conflict, there are different approaches to conflict, and learning which approach to use in a given situation seems to me is the most important thing. Sometimes it's okay to avoid conflict if it's a minor matter. The person, if it's something simple and really unimportant in this whole scheme of things, just let them do whatever it is they need to do and move on. So, you can avoid it or you can accommodate it. Learning, though, to compromise and reach a position where both parties maybe not are happy, but can at least live with it. It seems to me that's probably the biggest challenge. Sometimes people need a third person, like a mediator, to sit in and ask questions and make sure that tempers don't get out of control. Sometimes learning just to say, hey, let's take a break and walk away from it for a while. It seems to me that conflict is probably one of the most difficult things. If you can come to a win-win situation rather than a win-lose situation, where one person wins and the other person feels like they have completely lost, that seldom sets up future success for the relationship or the company. If both people can walk away feeling like they accomplished something that they wanted, I think that is the best situation. I realize you can't always do that. Sometimes owners or managers have to make decisions that others may not like. But if at all possible, trying to have something where everybody feels like they've gained something beneficial, or at least they've been heard, is the best way to approach that.
What are some specific strategies to help people feel heard, to help people feel respected, to help people understand one another a little bit better?
Well, one thing is not interrupting when someone's talking, and we're all good at that, right? We all interrupt because we think what we're thinking is more important, so we want to get it in. Let the other person speak. You don't have to agree with them, but let them share what they need to share. Paraphrase back to them what you've heard so that it indicates, yes, I was listening to you and here's what I heard. If what you paraphrase back and they say, well, no, that's not what I meant, then you've given them a chance to clarify it. And I think also not just paraphrasing content, but paraphrasing emotion. I see that you're upset by this. I see that you're worried. I hear anxiety in your voice. Acknowledging their feelings. It's interesting, I know, in some of the things I've read and in talking to people in certain situations, they've dealt with angry customers, and it's just customers at this point, not so much employees, but when they acknowledge the feeling that the customer was expressing, many times the individual calmed down and the situation was resolved in a way that was effective, just because they acknowledged the emotions of the individual. When you're able to do that, I think it really goes a long way to making people feel like, I'm heard, he's trying to understand me, and it can lower the temperature in the room so that there is not huge blow-ups that result in real problems.
It's such great advice. Eye language, acknowledging, understanding of feelings. It seems like there are a lot of things that people might have heard to do, but it's really hard to put it in practice. Do you have any advice for people who are struggling to put these kinds of skills that they might have learned in a class or in a video to put into practice?
It's like somebody shooting free throws, right? You think about basketball or baseball, any sport. In order to get good at something, you have to practice and practice a lot. I was thinking about Caitlin Clark, who just surpassed Pete Maravich as the leading scorer in college basketball, right? But I remember reading about Pete Maravich all those years ago, Pistol Pete. He would go out and shoot 200 jump shots, 300 jump shots every day. And that's how he got so good. To do this type of thing, it's not something that's just going to come naturally to any of us, I don't think. It won't be something that we can just sit down and spur the moment and do. You really do have to practice, I believe, in personal conversations with family and friends, or purposely having a friend sit down and, again, record yourself, tape yourself. How are you coming across? The more you practice these types of things, the more comfortable you'll be with them, the more second nature they'll become for you, and the more adept you'll become at using them in real life situations.
That's excellent advice. What are some other business communication things that people often struggle with in your courses?
I think a big item in communication in business, and I'm thinking in terms of presentations to groups, I think you use PowerPoint slides or whatever it might be, Google Slides, Prezi, things like that. So many people struggle with creating slides that are effective. And even though that sounds simple, we've all had to sit through presentations where the slides were not pleasant and were not very effective, right? And so learning how to do slides is something that can really help somebody when they're having to present in their business to a group of any size.
Do you have specific advice for putting together better slides and better presentations?
Absolutely. There was a YouTube video called How to Avoid Death by PowerPoint. And I think it offers some of the best advice on creating slides. He talks in here about things that he has some really good examples of bad slides, and then, some guidelines for creating good slides. And it's one I try to impress on students when they work on their slides. I mean, the common mistakes, people tend to cram lots of text on slides. Small print, long, lengthy sentences that nobody in an audience can read or will want to read. Or if they are trying to read the slide, they're not listening to the person doing the speaking. And so, those are some real problems. So, you want slides with dark background, light print and dark background, because it's easier for people to see. You want slides that use bullet points and not complete sentences. Complete sentences, unless it's a quote that it needs to be something like that. Normally, just short phrases, bullet points are much better. People can see them quickly. You can explain what they mean to the audience. No more than 6 or 7 lines of text on the slide. It's really important. After that, the fonts get too small. There's too much for people to comprehend. And so you want to limit that. You want images on many of your slides that coincide with the text. That's really important. When you bring slides up, that you refer to them and let people look at them. But it's okay to have a lot of slides. Sometimes a presentation will say, hey, no more than 6 slides or 7 slides. And so people cram all this information on that 6 or 7. It'd be much better to have 15 or 20 slides that are done well with limited text, images that really are attractive, that draw people. One thing too, like for example, in PowerPoint, the template automatically makes the slide heading bigger than the content text. And it really should be just the opposite. The heading is not the most important thing. That should be in relatively small text, maybe nothing smaller than a 24 size font. But then the text on the slide should be bigger than that so that people's eyes are drawn to that immediately. And, a 28 or 32 font or 36, things like that, much better. And so if people can learn to do that and create slides that are attractive and easy to understand, they're going to help themselves a lot when it comes to making presentation.
Let's talk about some of the other elements that make a good presentation outside of slides. I know that back when we had more face-to-face classes, you were much more in tune and able to understand and give feedback on nonverbals. Some of that definitely applies to being on camera. Can you talk to a little bit of the differences and what people need to do in the realm of nonverbals as they present their presentation to be more persuasive?
It is different online, obviously, but when you're talking to an audience, the huge thing is looking at them. Now, online with cameras and all, I know it changes somewhat, but if it's face-to-face, eye contact is so important. And it's one of the hardest areas for people. They're nervous. Many times they're tempted to just look at their notes the entire time and not look at people. But it's a terrible problem, and it really makes a person look like they lack confidence. It makes them ineffective as a speaker. The lack of enthusiasm is another thing I think is a huge issue. And again, it's usually because of anxiety, that people look like, to me, you will see people talking with each other and they're animated, they're laughing, they're smiling. And when they get up in front of others, it's like someone pours liquid death over their face and the smile goes away. There's no light in their eyes. Enthusiasm, I think, is pivotal to be effective when talking to others in any kind of a group setting, any kind of presentation. Looking at them, I think the use of gestures is a great way to show enthusiasm. Some vocal variety. You never want to be monotone. You want to be excited, enthusiastic. Those types of things can really help your presentations be much more effective.
What are some of the most common mistakes you see whenever you're assessing and you're looking at your criteria and you're trying to help people be better speakers?
You can teach people how to organize presentations. And since that's done on their own at home, that's usually not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is in the area of delivery, or if it pertains to content, many times it's because they don't do enough research to make their content credible. If all they do is stand up and share their opinions about things, unless they can qualify themselves as an expert, they lack credibility when they're speaking. And so taking the time to do research, to verbally tell people where you got this information and making sure those sources are credible is really important. But then this whole issue of delivery, of being excited, eye contact, using gestures, smiling, looking at people, not staring at them, but making brief eye contact with people as you talk. I think those are the areas I see most people struggle with. Probably they don't practice enough, I think, is where many people struggle. They think that, hey, I can wing this, I'll practice one time the night before, and then I'm ready to go. There are very, very few people, certainly I'm including myself in that, who can do that. Almost nobody I know of. I mean, anytime you're going to make a presentation to others and you're going to be nervous, the more you can prepare ahead of time and the more you practice, the better off you're going to be. I think it's important to have notes, but very limited notes. When I'm dealing with people, it's just called a speaking outline, just keywords, short phrases, so that you're not tempted to read to people. That's so important. If you read to people, or if you're looking at your slides the whole time and never at your audience, that's another problem. Try to think of any kind of presentation as a conversation with friends, conversation with classmates, your fellow employees. It's not a performance. You're not an actor on a stage. You're having a conversation. It should be structured. It should be organized. Talk to them in everyday language and just look at them and engage with them. And that'll make any presentation much more effective.
Are there any things that we can apply from presentations to other areas of business communication?
Clarity in your wording. And I'm thinking like in terms of email, for example, try to make sure to use the right word. Some words, words have, you think about language has a denotative aspect and a connotative aspect. Denotative, I would think in terms simply of the dictionary definition. What's the official meaning of the word? Connotation has to do with the emotional impact of it. And you might pick a word that, as far as the dictionary is concerned, is the right word. If the connotation is not what you mean to convey. It can create misunderstanding, ill will. People can get mad at you. One of the examples I try to use, for instance, in class, is the word. Think about someone who is small frame. They don't carry much weight on their body. If I tell my wife, "Dear, you look so slender in that dress," she's probably going to like that. If I say, "Honey, you're looking awful skinny in that dress," she probably is not going to like that too much. Even though both words have the same official meaning, the connotation of the terms is very different. Learning to consider the connotation of the language that you're using, especially in written material, since that's forever. An email is eternal. It will always exist. And so being very careful about the words you pick so that the person reading it is getting the emotional intent of what you're hoping to convey. I think that kind of thing is really important. And then in one-on-one conversation, I think it's harder to do because you're trying to think on the spur of the moment. But if you can learn to pick your words so that you're conveying what you really want to convey, I believe you really help yourself in those situations.
Are there other communication frameworks or models that come to mind that can help students navigate the complexities of business communication?
And I think of frameworks. To me, the key is, and I know this sounds really simple, but think before you speak. Think before you write. Don't blurt out the first things that comes to your mind. Many times you will have great regrets for doing that. For example, with emails or any type of written communication, it's a great idea to write it out and then walk away from it. Leave it, let it sit for an hour or two or a day. Come back and then reread it. And quite often you're going to think, "Oh my, I'm glad I didn't send that. That really would not have gone over very well at all." If you know that you're going to be in a situation like in a meeting that's coming up tomorrow, try to think ahead as to questions that might pop up, things that you might say, ways to answer anticipated questions in a way that conveys the information clearly, doesn't create problems or offend people in that meeting. I think we've all known people who tend to be like the proverbial bull in the china shop who just kind of push their way through everything and blurt out whatever they're thinking. A lot of times that can leave a lot of destruction in its wake. And so learning to really be patient, sit back, think, contemplate how your answers might be perceived is something that everybody can do to benefit themselves and those with whom they work.
And that's excellent advice that applies to more than just businesses and business communication, because we're each engaged in conversations and in relationship with one another, even if we're not talking about clients or employees or superiors and support every day.
If you think in terms of like the golden rule, for example, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If they can try to put themselves, and I know it's hard sometimes, when emotions are involved and personalities are clashing, but if they can try to put themselves in that other person's position and at least understand where they're coming from, I think it would help them be happier in their job, to be more effective in working with others, since most of us are going to work in situations where we're not working on our own. There are some folks that do, of course, but most of us work in businesses, corporations, small businesses, where we're surrounded by other people. Learning to try to treat them, to talk to them as you would like them to talk to you is a good rule of thumb. Doesn't always work. They may not reciprocate, but remember, you're not responsible for them. You're responsible for yourself. So learn to control yourself, bite your tongue if necessary, perhaps literally at times. Treat them, talk to them like you hope they would do so to you. It seems to me is a great way, a simple rule that can kind of guide all of your interactions in the business setting, as well as interpersonal relationships at home and elsewhere.
Respect, empathy, the golden rule, all of these things, I think, can be summarized in our business communication courses, in those chapters that deal with not only conflict, not only relationships and client side, not only presentations, but that idea of working with teams and working with small groups to get something done. Because a lot of these things interconnect, right? What are some things that might be specific to group and teamwork that maybe didn't show as well when we're talking about relationship management, conflict management, and client-side management?
Groups and teams, I personally think, are probably one of the hardest things, just because you've got different personalities, different communication styles, extroverts, introverts. It can be really challenging. I mean, learning that groups, need to be kept to a certain size. The larger the group, the more difficult the communication, because channels of communication increase exponentially the more people you add to the group. It's an online group that makes it even more challenging. But learning that people tend to fall into specific roles in groups. There'll be some people that really talk a lot and oftentimes will tend to dominate, some people that don't talk any. And if you're the leader of a group like that, learning to conduct a meeting where you can politely encourage those who talk too much to let others talk, and then asking questions to bring those who aren't talking much to get them involved, so that they're also sharing their insights and thoughts. Knowing that some people do better in a group as a note taker, for example, or some people do better as a devil's advocate. It's oftentimes a good idea in a group, especially if there's money involved, where companies think about investing money, to have a devil's advocate, someone who is going to try to point out the weaknesses of a proposed idea. Groups are susceptible to groupthink. We've seen these kinds of things over the years. I always go back to Coca-Cola's decision many decades ago where they came out with New Coke, and they changed the formula for the existing Coke, which was wildly popular and selling great all over the world. And I remember when New Coke came out, it was like, it's not very good, and somebody made a decision and nobody questioned it. And it was not a very good decision at all. And groupthink is something that can happen. So having somebody who is willing to kind of challenge people on those ideas, that can help a group function better. Groups that meet more often tend to do better than the groups that don't. If the group leader is someone who can make sure that everyone is sharing and no one is dominating, knowing that groups tend to go through stages. They form, they develop norms. Do we start on time, or hey, it doesn't matter when we start, that kind of thing. And knowing that there will be conflict, almost always there's going to be some conflict, helping the group get through that to the stage where they can then actually become productive and create the product or solve the problem they've been tasked with. Helping them do that and perhaps socialize outside of the work setting so that they really begin to trust each other and know each other. Those kinds of things can be helpful when groups are operating. And groups do have problem people. Some people just tend to fall in these roles. They challenge ideas not for the purpose of making things better, but just for the purpose of causing chaos. A group leader has to recognize that there are problem people and that they may have to deal with them, perhaps not publicly, but privately, take them aside, find out what's going on. If the person leading the group has the power to do so, they may need to replace an individual with somebody else sometimes, just because that person can be so disruptive that the group can't accomplish what they need to do. But groups are interesting, very seldom boring, but learning to manage it is really important, I think, for success in many situations.
So in groups we have, for example, I think it's like forming, storming, norming, and performing, right? Like that's a nice framework for understanding how groups might interact over time. What about those meetings you're referring to? Are there certain tips and tricks to organizing an effective meeting? Should we put some things at the beginning, some things in the middle, some things in the end? What does an effective meeting look like? Because I know that meetings are something that a lot of people struggle with, not just online, but face-to-face too. And we have struggled so much to adapt back when COVID hit to bring all of that know-how online. And I think a lot of the things that we taught about meetings still apply even more so with online. For example, we can start with, do we really need a meeting, right? Maybe you can take it from, do we really need a meeting, all the way to, what does a really good agenda feel like and look like?
I think so many meetings are unnecessary and people get tired of them. They feel like it's wasting their time. And so that would really be the first step is, do we really need this? Could I send out an email listing these things and just everybody can read it and can concur without having to take the time to get together or join an online setting? Absolutely. Most people get tired of meetings and some people spend their whole days in meetings and they feel like they're not productive. So do you really need the meeting? Another thing is, a simple thing is an agenda. What time will you start? What time will you end? To me, I think that's really important. What are the specific items you're going to cover? Send it out ahead of time, a day ahead if possible, or 2 days, so that people can look at it and have some idea of where you're headed with the meeting. If you're conducting the meeting, use that agenda to control what's going on. Again, many times you're going to have one or two people that talk a lot and some people that don't talk any. And you can use that saying, okay, Ryan, I appreciate your input there, but we need to end here in the next 20 minutes. So let's set that aside. I'll talk to you after the meeting adjourns and I'll be sure to try to answer your questions at that point. But you can use that agenda, especially the finishing time, to keep things going so that, we've all seen meetings where we get off on a tangent and nothing is accomplished that we had hoped to accomplish. So as simple as it is, that agenda can really be a great tool to keep on track, get people involved that you would like to be involved, perhaps control people that are doing too much talking, and end the thing on time. I don't know anybody who likes a meeting that goes too long. Try to stay with what you need to do and get things accomplished in a timely manner. So important.
If you could give people advice to improve one core business communication skill, what would that skill be and what would that advice look like?
Learn to interact with people in a way, I don't mean to be overly syrupy nice, but being kind when at all possible. I realize at times you can't be. At times employers have to fire people. They have to confront employees that are doing something they shouldn't do. But as a general rule, if you can maintain morale within the employees, be truthful, be honest, but treat people with respect and kindness, it makes the workplace a much better place. Now, I realize you can't do that in every setting. Some jobs don't permit that. I'm sure the military cannot function primarily on kindness, but in situations, in the corporate world and small businesses, type of thing can go a long way to making people feel valued. And when employees feel valued, they're more productive and the company's going to make more money, which is, obviously very important. And as simple as that sounds, I think that's really important.
I agree 100% because kindness is often overlooked, not on purpose, right? It's the kind of thing that we don't put in the forefront of our mind all the time when maybe we should. So maybe you can give us some specific examples of what kindness might look like from an employee perspective or from an employer perspective or from an entrepreneurial perspective or a client perspective. What does kindness look like in action? We're talking about business communication situations that are more difficult. Obviously, it's really hard to be kind when you have to fire someone. Really hard to be kind when a business relationship is no longer working. It's really hard to rise to the level of kindness in those sensitive or difficult situations. So maybe you can give us some ideas of what that looks like in the context, making sure your business is taken care of and making sure that people are taken care of.
Well, I think of two things. One would be to ask questions of the other person. Hey, what is going on? And give them a chance to explain. And again, try to paraphrase emotion. I can tell that you're really upset. Why? Letting people do that when possible. And I know you can't do it always. I think that is a really valuable tool. We're all really good at talking at each other, but learning to really listen, be quiet. Questions, I think, are a good way to elicit that type of information that can help you then understand that person much more effectively. I was thinking too about the way that we deal with having to offer criticism, not constructive criticism. The Oreo method, where you start out with praise, you then offer the constructive criticism, and you finish with praise. Whenever you can do that with an employee, I think that is beneficial. That way they don't feel like they're just being crushed under your heel, so to speak. And again, I know not every situation lends itself to that, and not every employee lends themselves to that. Sometimes you can't do that. But most people, I think, really want to do a good job. They want to be productive. They want to help the company. They want to keep their job. You as the owner want your company to grow. So if you can interact with people that way, I believe you give yourself a much better chance to do well.
Do you have any advice for the other side of that equation? The Oreo method is tried, true, and tested, right? But what about upward communication, where I have a problem or I have an issue that I need help with? I'm trying to communicate to a supervisor what that looks like and how that feels. And I'm trying to maybe get buy-in for an initiative, or I'm trying to move this organization forward, but I have to communicate upward in order to be able to do that. Do you have any advice for that person?
I think that can be more difficult depending on the individual with whom you're communicating. We've all had managers or bosses who were not the easiest to communicate with. If possible, if you know the individual, hopefully you have been able, by watching them and listening to them, you've been able to learn certain things that they respond to in a positive way, whether it's certain words, certain types of communication. Perhaps they prefer face-to-face versus an email. So you talk to them face-to-face. Perhaps it's just the opposite. They don't have time for you to talk. It's take a lot of their time during the day. So you send them an email. Asking questions, I think in almost all situations, being respectful is important. You don't want to accuse them something that you've got in your own head that may not be true. And so being respectful, asking questions, indicating that what you're talking about could help the company do better, could help the department do better, make more money, keep the employees happier, things like that. I know sometimes it's impossible, because I've had people I've worked with that they were just not very reasonable individuals, and it made things very difficult. But hopefully, most of the time, you're going to have somebody that you can do that.
More great advice. We appreciate that. Ken, where can people find you online if they want to get in touch with you?
They can email me through the email at UTSA, ken.harris@utsa.edu.
Excellent. And what was your full title?
Assistant Professor of Practice.
Assistant Professor of Practice, Ken Harris. Thank you so much for being here today. Do you have any final thoughts to leave our audience about business communication?
I would just say that keeping people first is ultimately the most important thing a business can do. Keeps customers happy, will keep the employees happier. The owner, life is short, and obviously making money is very important. But in the long run, if we have to hurt other people while we're doing that, I'm not sure that's the best way to approach life.
I now have to ask you about servant leadership, because what you just described sounds like a beautiful description of what it means to be a servant leader and to serve your employees, to serve your people, to serve your subordinates and your superiors in a way that is ethical. Can you speak just a little bit about servant leadership for us?
Leadership, I think, has different requirements. Sometimes the leader has to issue orders, and there can't be room for discussion. Again, I think about the military. Sergeant says, hey, do it. You can't sit around and discuss it. It has to be done, right? Or in an emergency with firefighters or police officers where, it's an emergency, hey, do it. But in many situations, a leader who has a heart willing to serve others, I think that really transforms a business when people can see that someone who is way up the ladder, so to speak, is willing to get down there and get their hands dirty, to work with others, to be there. It does something to that person's heart, for one thing. They see themselves in a much more realistic light. They're just a person. They're not going to live forever. And so, serving others is a way to benefit those people, but it does something beneficial to your own heart as well.
Ken Harris, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you taking the time to share your wisdom advice here today.
Thank you for having me, Ryan. Great to talk to you.